This is going to be our first lecture of Module 4. In this lecture, we're going to be going over cable and raceway. We're going to be covering articles 320 to 362. This lecture is going to be a little bit different than our previous lectures. Instead of focusing on one part of the NEC or one article from the NEC, we're going to be taking a look at a collection of different articles that are all laid out in a very similar way and kind of dissect that layout and understand that so that we can apply it to all of those articles. So we'll be looking at a couple specific articles from that range of 320 to 362 so that we can understand that layout. So our lesson objectives, we're going to identify the common layout of articles for conduit and cable. We're going to list uses permitted and uses not permitted for a variety of cables and conduits, and then we're going to understand securing and supporting requirements for a variety of cable and conduits. So as I mentioned, all these articles in that 320 to 362 range, they're laid out very similarly. You can kind of break down that range of articles even further, as we kind of see here with our objectives, into cable types and conduit types. Your cable types are going to be laid out just a little bit differently than your conduit types. However, all of your cables are going to be laid out almost the exact same, and all of your conduits are going to be laid out almost the exact same. And then you'll still have some similarities between cables and conduits, which is what we'll mainly be focusing on. Definitions, we don't really have any applicable definitions for this lecture. It's going to be a pretty simple lecture where we really just go through terms and definitions we've already addressed previously. So starting off, Articles 320 to 362. Articles 320 to 362 cover different cable and conduit types. So as I said here, Articles 320 to 362 cover the cable and conduit types recognized by the NEC. In other words, if there is a type of cable or a type of conduit that you're going to be using, installing, or that there's a code about, it's going to be somewhere in that 320 to 362 range. There's a common layout followed for each of these articles in the 320 to 362 range. So for these, you're always going to have part 1 is going to be general, part 2 is going to be your installation methods, and part 3 is going to be your construction specifications. So once again, keep in mind, everything we talk about, this is for all these articles 320 to 362. So if you go to any article in that range, part 2 is going to cover the installation of that type of cable or that type of conduit. Part 1 is going to cover the general information for that cable or that type of conduit. So our first example article here we're going to be taking a look at, it's going to be Article 334. Article 334 is non-metallic sheath cable, types NM, NMC, and NMS. I picked this because NM is a cable type most of you have probably worked with or seen at this point. So looking at 334, we're just going to be walking through some of these bullet points very quickly, not really talk about the specific information in them, but we're going to be focusing more on what each section is. So we see that 334.1 covers scope, 334.2 covers definitions, 334.6 covers listing requirements. So to meet one of our objectives here, we see 334.10 list uses permitted, with A covering specifics for NM, B for NMC, and C for NMS. Once again, with Article 334, we do have those 3 categories of different non-metallic sheath cables, those being NM, NMC, and MMS. So for this article specifically, 334.10, which is always going to be your uses permitted, gets broken down a little bit more. So part 1 here is going to be for 1 and 2 family dwellings along with attached or detached garages. Part 2 is multifamily dwellings that are type 3, 4, and 5 construction. Part 3, other type 3, 4, and 5 construction buildings if concealed behind walls or protected by a fire barrier. Part 4, cable trays in type 3, 4, or 5 construction. And types 1 or 2 construction where in suitable raceway. So I've included a couple examples here of what's covered in 334.10. in Article 334. Since this is a section that you'll have to reference very regularly for these different articles, your dot 10. Once again, just to stress, this is for the entire 320 to 362 range. Your dot 10 is always going to be uses permitted. So I want to make sure everybody had kind of an understanding of what kind of information is covered in uses permitted. This is essentially where you're allowed to install that cable or conduit type at. Article 334, uses not permitted. 334.12 lists uses not permitted, with dot 12 once again always being your uses not permitted, with A covering NM and NMC and NMS, and B covering NM and NMS. So part 1 here, any dwelling or structure not permitted in 334.10, 1, 2, 3, or 5. So in other words, if it's not listed in dot 10, which was our uses permitted, then it is not permitted. 2, in a drop ceiling other than 1 or 2 family dwellings. 3, as a service entrance cable. And we're going to skip on to 8. 4 through 7 cover some pretty specific information. Once again, this is just to get a general idea of how this dot 12 works. Number 8, in hoistways or elevators or escalators. And 9, embedded in poured cement, concrete, or aggregate. So once again, your dot 12 is always going to be covering uses not permitted. And this is kind of the general layout of how that goes. So in other words, anything listed in dot 12 means you cannot install that cable or that conduit in that type of area or under that specific circumstances or for that specific use. We see with 3, regardless of where or how you're installing it, you can never use NM as a service entrance cable. And dot 10 we also have in hazardous locations except where otherwise permitted. Moving on, we have bending and supporting. 334.24 covers bending radius for NM, NMC, and NMS cables. So your bending radius is going to be something a little bit specific to your cables. As I mentioned before, you have some rules that are going to be general to the cable types, some rules that are going to be general to the conduit types, and bending radius is one of those things for cable. 334.30 covers securing and supporting requirements. This is another very important item to note. This is a common section for both cables and conduits. Dot 30 is always going to cover securing and supporting. So we see for NM, NMC, and NMS cables, they must be supported and secured by staples, listed cable ties, straps, hangers, or other fittings. They must be secured every 4.5 feet and within 12 inches of every entry point. So essentially, dot 30 is going to tell you how you have to secure and support that given type of material and how often you have to secure and support it. So we can see with our first point here, it tells us it has to be secured using these type of items, whether it be a staple or a cable tie. And then our second bullet point here tells us how often we have to use one of those support methods. Moving on from there, we're going to be looking at boxes and opacity. 334.40 covers requirements for boxes and fittings. 334.80 covers the allowable opacity ratings. Specifically for NM cables, the rating cannot exceed the 60 degrees Celsius column of our table 310.15b16. The 90 degrees Celsius column may be used for correction if the final opacity does not exceed the 60 degrees Celsius column. From there, we have construction specifications. This would be into our part 3 of Article 334. 334.100 covers the construction of the actual cable. 334.104 covers the conductors within the cable. 334.108 covers the equipment grounding conductors. 334.112 covers the insulation of the individual conductors. And 334.116 covers the sheath of the cable. We have to keep in mind this is a cable, so it has an outer sheath with inner conductors. So that concludes 334. Now we're going to be taking a look at another cable type many of you may have worked with or seen at this point, which is covered in Article 330. This is going to be metal clad cable type MC. So once again, just kind of walking through these points the same way. Hopefully, having just went through 334, these will sound very familiar to you now. 330.1 covers the scope. 330.2 covers definitions. 330.6 covers listing requirements. 330.10 list uses permitted. 330.12 list uses not permitted. 330.24 covers bending radius. 330.30 list requirements for securing and supporting. 330.80 covers allowable opacity ratings. 330.104 covers construction. 330.108 covers equipment grounding conductors. 330.112 covers insulation. And 330.116 covers the sheath of the cable. So once again, we've kind of just walked through this entire article really on this one slide. As I said, at this point, there's not really a need to go into the specific information about MC cable because the goal of this is just to make you understand this layout. Obviously, it would be near impossible to remember each one of these specific requirements for every single cable and conduit type in the NEC. What's important is understanding what part of the article to go to get that information. So you need to know that if you needed to know the bending radius of an MC cable, you need to go to Article 330, Section 24, 330.24, in order to find the bending radius. And the same idea with your securing and supporting requirements, your uses permitted and your uses not permitted. And to stress again, as you can see, looking at all these, vast majority of these are identical to our section numbers for our NM cable, the only difference being the article number. So switching from our cable types to our conduit types now, the first conduit we're going to be taking a look at is going to be Article 344, rigid metal conduit type RMC. As I mentioned before, a lot of these sections are going to look very familiar from our cable types. However, for conduit, there are a couple different sections that are specific to conduit, just like you'll see that cable had a couple sections that were specific to it. So 344.1 covers the scope, 344.2 covers definitions, 344.6 covers the listing requirements. These are all identical to our cable types. .10 list uses permitted. .12 list uses not permitted. Once again, identical to our cable types. Here we have a couple of different ones specific to cable, to conduit. 344.20 covers sizes. 344.22 covers the number of conductors allowed. 344.24 covers how bends can be made. And 344.26 covers the allowable number of bends in a run. Once again, these are some requirements specific to conduit types. 344.30 lists requirements for securing and supporting. And 344.100 covers the construction. And 344.120 covers the required markings for the conduit. So looking now at what is essentially the entirety of Article 344, we can see once again, going back to our cable types, a lot of these sections are exact rollovers from the cable types. However, specifically with our .20s and a couple of our .100s, we do have a couple that are different from the cable, but they still follow the general idea. And you do have to keep in mind that your parts are all going to be the same. Our Part 1 general, Part 2 installation, and Part 3 construction. So you're still going to find that type of information in each part of these of the conduit articles. Looking at one more example of our conduit here, we're going to take a look at Article 358, which is electrical metallic tubing type EMT. Once again, 358.1 covers scope, 358.2 covers definitions, 358.6 covers listing requirements, 358.10 list uses permitted, 358.12 list uses not permitted. .20 covers our sizes, .22 covers our number of conductors allowed. As you can see, these .20s, and we'll go ahead and going to our next point here, dot 24 covers how bends can be made, and dot 26 covers the allowable number of bends in a run. So we can see the dot 20s here are the same as with our rigid metal conduit 344 because they're both a conduit type. Like I said, stress once again, your cables have some specific requirements for cable, and your conduits have some specific requirements for conduit. 344.30 lists requirements for securing and supporting. 358.100, and I apologize, that previous slide for securing and supporting also should have been 358.30 lists requirements for securing and supporting. 358.100 covers construction, and 358.120 covers our required markings. Once again, we can see our dot 100 category sections are also identical to our rigid metal conduit 344. Once again, those are just some similar items between our conduit types. So that wraps up our first lecture for Module 4. Wasn't a very long module, as said, just kind of a general walkthrough of how to look at those articles 320 to 362. Really see that in reality, most of them are very identical in how they're laid out. You're just going to have specific information in each section about that particular type of cable or conduit that you need to be able to find relatively quickly during an exam. So in our next session, which will be our second and final lecture for Module 4, we're going to be taking a look at our Chapter 9 tables and our Annex C.